Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to Craig and Tuans for the opportunity to address you today about our experience in Australia of advancing connectivity, particularly to underserved communities, including in our rural, regional and remote areas of Australia. I'd like to start by paying my respects to Indigenous Australians of the lands on which I am today, and that's the Dharawal peoples, and acknowledge our respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of the lands and waters of Australia. We acknowledge their historical and ongoing custodianship of country and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I expect that most Tuans members are aware of ACCAN and our role as the national peak body representing communications consumers in Australia. And I have the privileged role of being the CEO of ACCAN, a role I've now been in for a year. I have a 20-year history leading national peak bodies through organisational growth and achieving real outcomes for consumers and those most vulnerable in our communities by building an evidence base of research and policy informed by the consumer voice and bringing it to strategic partnerships with government, with business, with the community. And I've been involved in delivering change through reforms across health, aged care, and more recently, gambling reform. So in short, ACCAN and our teams work really hard to ensure communications policy in this country represents the best interests of consumers. We work quite hard to do that, closely with many regional and rural representative groups, as well as underserved communities, to understand the sort of choices, the frustrations and the decisions that the Australians on the ground face every day when it comes to staying connected. Australia has one of the lowest population densities in the world and one of the most geographically diverse terrains. Our communities are separated by vast distances, often with limited or no terrestrial infrastructure. And that makes Australia's connectivity challenges really unique. Particularly in rural, remote and regional areas, there are slow internet speeds, unreliable coverage, limited competition, largely due to high infrastructure costs that often render the provision of services economically unviable. And that significantly impacts the equity of access to essential services. It affects the economic and social opportunities that people have in those areas and contributes to a connectivity divide. It really impacts our overall productivity, our wealth and our well-being as a nation. The 2023 Digital Inclusion Index shows that people living in these areas consistently trail behind those in the cities when it comes to access, to affordability and to digital ability. The divide is even more serious for First Nations communities. They have a digital inclusion score of 7.5 points lower than non-First Nations Australia. This gap grows significantly when it comes to remote communities by 21.6 points in difference, and very remote communities, 23.5 difference. And that's where a lack of infrastructure and reliable access remain persistent barriers to digital participation. So really, communications have become just, the lifeline, the crucial for everyday activities like remote work, education, healthcare, staying connected to family and friends, safety. It's just absolutely fundamental. And in those rural, remote, regional communities, robust communication infrastructure is not merely a convenience, it's vital for safety, especially in emergency situations where access to 000 and timely emergency updates can save lives. We think that at ACCAN that communications are an essential service and should be treated that way. In those communities, it is just absolutely critical, and there is this regulatory gap that exposes consumers in those areas to the risks of service failure, digital exclusion and affordability barriers. And it limits, the strategic investment, the resilience planning, all of these things that are necessary for essential infrastructure. So guaranteeing universal access to our communities in these areas is really, really important. And we think it should be a central objective of policy and regulatory frameworks. So rural, regional and remote initiatives. Australia's governments have long acknowledged that there are unique challenges in these areas when it comes to communications. So initiatives like the Mobile Black Spot Program, the Regional Connectivity Program, the On-Farm Connectivity Program, all of these programs have attempted to improve infrastructure and backhaul and targeted locations where there's no commercial incentives to invest. There's also been increasing support for satellite-based services, particularly LEOSat or low Earth orbit satellites like Starlink. These are being used in remote Indigenous communities and farming communities. They're fast, they're flexible, but they also raise issues about cost, the consumer protections, the long-term reliability of these sorts of services. So it's not a certainty. It's something that we need to ensure we get right, but certainly the way of the future. They remain fragmented, these services. We're consistently hearing from consumers that services are unreliable, prices are high, choice is limited, and that complaints handling is poor. So the technology is advancing, but many people are still relying on public phones and copper landlines or have no internet connections at all. So modernising the USO is probably one of the most significant policy conversations underway in Australia at the moment. The current USO framework is outdated. It largely funds Telstra, our biggest telco, to provide voice services via the copper network, so landlines and payphones, services that many consumers are no longer using as their primary communications tool. So in terms of an outcome-focused USO, ACCAN supports modern, flexible, inclusive services. It should reflect how people actually communicate today and their communication needs well into the future. In our submission to the USO review, we recommended that responsibility for delivering the USO should transition to NBN-Co, so our national broadband wholesaler. That would bring the USO into alignment with broadband, digital capability and modern infrastructure. By modernising the USO, we must do more than just change who delivers it. It must change what is delivered. So for that, we're calling for a capabilities-led, technology-neutral approach. So the USO should guarantee access to essential services, connectivity that enables us to connect to healthcare, education, government services, not prescribe a particular technology like fixed line voice. And it means really that what we're talking about here is, and it means minimum standards for speed, for reliability, for affordability, for accessibility. These are fundamental now with, room for regular updates as technology and community expectations evolve, as they inevitably do. So in Australia, we've been having a conversation about the Universal Outdoor Mobile Obligation, or UOMO. It's really important as a proposal that introduces a shift in the way that telecommunications policy operates by formally recognising that mobile coverage is a baseline service. It's essential, it's not optional for all Australians, regardless of where they live. And it's no longer a convenience. So it's how people communicate, it's how they work, access services, and importantly, call for help in an emergency. With 97% of Australians using mobile services and now more than 60% relying solely on mobile for voice communication, the absence of guaranteed mobile coverage leaves especially rural, remote and regional and First Nations communities dangerously exposed. The recent Optus outage, which was back in 2023, left millions of people without services, including access to 000. That was a stark reminder that mobile resilience and redundancy are not just technical issues, but actually public safety imperatives. In this context, text 000 has also become a pressing and long overdue policy gap. So unlike countries such as New Zealand, but also the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia still does not offer a reliable, real-time, text-based emergency service or an emergency messaging system. So that really disproportionately affects people, who are maybe deaf or hard of hearing, have a speech disability, those who live in areas with limited voice coverage, but basic SMS functionality, individuals who experience domestic and family violence. They may be unsafe or unable to speak. So it really does impact these sorts of groups in particular. A real-time text to 000 service would be a low-cost, high-impact reform and one that would align with Australia's disability rights obligations, closing the gap targets and the broader equity objectives that we have in place. It's also a natural complement to the UOMO. So we want to see both the UOMO and text to 000 services introduced together. It's a twin pillar approach to an inclusive, accessible and resilient mobile safety net that would meet the needs of all Australians. So on the issue of affordability, as we all know, infrastructure is only half the story, but affordability is the other. In our consultations, consumers repeatedly told us that cost is a critical barrier to digital inclusion. And it's not just the cost of services, it's the devices, it's the data, it's the lack of understanding of plans and the penalties when things go wrong. We've proposed a policy called No Australian Left Offline. It's a concessional broadband product that would subsidise NBN's wholesale pricing so that retailers could offer an unlimited 50 megabits per second service to low-income households for about $30 a month. We estimate that over 1 million households could benefit. It's simple, it's targeted, it would have an immediate impact. Importantly, affordability is not just about price points, it's about consumer protection. And too often we see poor sales practices, misleading plan structures, or consumers being signed up to contracts they don't understand or they just simply can't afford. That's particularly true in First Nations communities. And that's why we're also calling for stronger regulation of industry practices, direct consumer safeguards, and reform of outdated codes like the Telecommunications Consumer Protections Code. We think this is really fundamental and certainly underpins all of the conversations that we've had with consumers. So what does the future look like? Well, looking ahead, the future of connectivity, especially for our underserved communities, must be deemed an essential service. It's inherent in that is a communications landscape that's available, affordable, accessible. It must be inclusive by design, and that means that policies, infrastructure and services must actively consider the needs of our First Nations peoples, people with a disability, and those with low digital literacy or English proficiency. We support the development of the First Nations Digital Support Hub, including the culturally appropriate resources they provide and the digital mentors and free community Wi-Fi in remote areas. We advocate for the development of easy English contracts, complaint guides for First Nations languages and place-based community consultation. And second, we need to build resilient systems. Natural disasters are becoming really frequent and much more intense. And so connectivity failures during floods, fires and storms can have devastating consequences. And we saw that recently with a tropical cyclone in Queensland. We need networks with backup power, mobile roaming during outages and greater infrastructure sharing across providers. And third, we need smarter public infrastructure. Free public Wi-Fi at payphones is a great start, but we also need 24/7 accessible video relay options and text 000 established in Australia. Fourthly, we must invest in digital literacy. Government and industry must work together to support training programs, local digital mentors, trusted information services, and especially for those communities that face language, literacy, or financial barriers. Such as the ADIA, there is an Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance, National Digital Inclusion Strategy. And finally, we need evidence-based decision-making, and that includes reinstating digital inclusion questions in our national census to guide future investment. So we think that there is a positive future if these things can be achieved. I thank you for listening and look forward to the panel discussion.